There we are. Professor, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, excellent. Perfect. Perfect. Good. Thank you for joining me again. Look, I am so sorry for the other day. I don't
No
know what went
problem.
on with the audio. I could not hear you in that audio when I listened to it again. This time around, everything seems to be okay. The volume and everything seems to be
Okay.
right. And I can hear you perfectly fine. So let's light this candle. I'm going to record it now. I'm going to put it up immediately. In fact, it's recording as we speak. Um, and I am going to launch after. Let me make sure. Recording. And yes, the video is being recorded. Excellent. Um, so I'm just going to announce who you are, and I'm going to go into it and start the interview. We are joined with Professor Mohammad Marandi. He's been on the show before. He's a great friend of this channel. I deeply appreciate him rejoining us for a conversation that did not go well last time because of technical issues. This time around, we seem to be doing well. Professor, thank you for joining me. Professor Marandi, he is Professor of English Literature and Orientalism at the University of Tehran. Professor, I guess the first question is, it's Trump's world, apparently. He seems to be reshaping global events with an understanding that we're in a multipolar world, and he is going with this idea of America first. What does that mean for Iran, from your point of view?
It's difficult to say because, after all, a multipolar world means that it's not Trump's world. And I think he will have to reconcile with that reality if he wants to move the United States in a different direction. Right now, there's a lot of euphoria about the negotiations between the United States and Russia. Of course, not in Europe, and not in parts of the United States, but in many parts of the world. The easing of tensions and the end of slaughter is a good thing. But it's still very early to be sure that this is going to come to an end. I'm a bit more skeptical than some because the differences between the United States and Russia are uh, pretty extensive. Uh, it's not just about territory, but it is about territory.
Mhm.
Places like Odessa, for example. It's also about the security of the continent, but also the future of Ukraine and Russian assets that have been taken, the sanctions. There are a host of issues where the differences are enormous. And if Trump uh, does the right thing and concedes what he should concede, he may have a crisis to deal with at home. So I'm not sure where this is going to go, but obviously, an end to the slaughter in Ukraine is uh, is definitely something that we should hope for. For
Given
Iran,
No, please continue. I'm sorry.
yes, I think for Iran, uh, what has happened over the last 24 years or so has helped bring about a new world order, meaning the endless wars that the United States carried out in Afghanistan after 9/11, in Afghanistan and then in Iraq, and then the multiple dirty wars, the sanctions, the animosity that it showed towards Iran and towards other countries, and of course the war in Ukraine, plus uh, foolish neoliberal economic policies. All of these combined, I think, have depleted uh, American energy and power to a large degree. The United States was the hyperpower in the eyes of many,
Yeah.
after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I think U.S. arrogance uh, led to these endless wars, and also greed pushed the United States in a very different direction, and it led to where we are now. So for
Agreed.
Iran, today the opportunities for a better world, if we could call it that, are much greater than they were when the United States was at the height of its power. Because back then, the United States expected everyone to obey. They considered themselves to be exceptional, following the tradition of Eurocentrism, and and they saw themselves as superior to the rest of us, and that we had sort of reached the end of history, as Fukuyama put it, and therefore we had to all be subservient to the United States. And as the hyperpower, it was very dangerous to do anything otherwise. Back then, Iran was perhaps the only country that really stood up to the United States, and it was very tough. But as the United States engaged in war after war, and as the economy declined, the economic crisis in 2008 and 9, and until we got to where we are, things changed, and Iran's position strengthened, and the position of the United States weakened, relatively speaking. The United States is still a superpower, but
Right.
it's not what it was, and Iran is still uh, uh, a a country that is pretty large in West Asia. It's not a superpower, but it is much more influential and stronger than it was back then. So I think that Iran's position today is very different from the past. And if Trump wants to antagonize Iran, he will not have the success, even though he wasn't successful during his previous term, but he will not have that limited success that he had a few years ago. Um, he will have much less success, but he will be harmed much more than he was before, because Iran knows how to push back. And Iran today is stronger than, comparatively speaking, than it was back then. So a
Hmm.
lot depends on Trump. Everything depends on Trump. If Trump moves forward in with Russia and is able to uh, end the war and to keep the his political opponents in Washington in check, and his political opponents and enemies in Europe in check, maybe that would push him towards dealing with our region differently. But that central to all of this for Iran is the Palestinian issue. And we cannot have peace in the region without justice for Palestine. It's not going to happen. And Iranians are not going to relinquish Palestine. For Iranians, it's a principle. Many in the West like to say that Iran is cynical. Has been using the Palestinian cause to gain concessions. Iran has, because of its position on Palestine, been punished and attacked for decades by the United States. If Iran wanted concessions, if Iran wanted more favorable, more favorable relationship with the West, it would have sold out the Palestinian cause many years ago.
Okay.
Hezbollah would have done the same. Ansarullah would have done the same. They would have cashed in. But the issue is a humanitarian issue. But in the West, they cannot comprehend. I mean, this is how it is, Jamal. In the West, elites cannot comprehend, and many people outside of those elites, because of the narrative building, they cannot comprehend that Iran is more principled than the West, because that just does not compute. They
Mm-mm.
cannot imagine that, because it does not fit in with that sense of superiority, and that sense of having a superior culture and a superior civilization, and caring more about human rights, and caring more about women and freedom and dignity and honor. But what we've seen during the past year and a half in the region is that the West, the United States, the Europeans, they supported the Holocaust, they supported daily slaughter, they supported slaughter in Lebanon, they supported Al Qaeda in Syria.
Yep.
Now it's all coming out. We've seen Tulsi Gabbard say things in front of senators that have never been said before about the false flag operations in Syria, regarding chemical weapons, about U.S. support for ISIS and Al Qaeda in Syria, the things that we've been saying for years, but we've been ridiculed or ignored. So many in the West simply cannot comprehend that for Iran, this is a principle. The Palestinian issue is key. The Palestinian people are, the revolution itself had two foreign policy issues that were very important. One was, of course, Iranian independence and sovereignty. The revolutionaries during the Islamic Revolution, they were saying the Shah's regime, its decisions are being made in Washington and back then in London. Decisions should be made in Tehran. The two other issues were South Africa, apartheid South Africa, and Palestine. And as soon as the revolution happened, so this is not just 10 years ago, 20 years ago, this is not about concessions. After the revolution, they shut down what was the equivalent of the Israeli embassy. They shut down the South African embassy. They began to support the South African resistance, including the military wing, such as the military wing of the ANC, the African National Congress, for those who are younger. And they supported the Palestinians, the PLO, and the movement for the liberation of Palestine. This happened on day one of the revolution. So it isn't, for Iran, it is an ideological issue. It's not simply about Islam. Because as I said, the Palestinian issue and the South African issue were two parallel issues for the revolutionaries. And when apartheid South Africa ultimately collapsed, there was one remaining issue, and that was Palestine. And it continues to be the Iranian policy that what happens in Palestine has to be like what happened in South Africa, an end of racial or ethnic supremacism. That is what Iran is calling for in the land of Palestine, from the river to the sea. An end to racial supremacism, an end to ethno-supremacism, whatever you want to call it. That is what Iran wants. And for some reason, this is outrageous and unacceptable.
Give me your take on Pezeshkian. And the reason I'm asking that, so looking at TASM News, looking at Press TV, there's a lot of talk about new weapon systems that Iran is deploying. By the same token, the criticism that has been leveled by some at Pezeshkian is that he was not aggressive enough in dealing with Israel. Israel has gone on a murder spree for over a year and a half. The Arab states have done nothing, have just sat there and complained without necessarily doing anything materially to deal with that issue. Iran did launch True Promise 1 and True Promise 2. True Promise 3, however, was not launched. And some of the conversation behind the scenes, or at the very least reporting, is that Pezeshkian was not interested in escalation. He wanted to make deals with the West, and he was far more open to making deals with the S for some kind of economic leeway, basically relieving some of the sanctions that are going after Iran. What is your take on this? How do you view this? Do you think that he wasn't aggressive enough? Do you think he is more in line with looking for economic opportunities as opposed to, let's say, more staunchly in the defense point of view? Give me your thoughts on this. I'm curious on your take on this because you follow this deeply, and so you would have a much closer point of view on this. What are your thoughts?
Iran's position on the axis of resistance I think is clear. Iran funds the axis of resistance, whether it's in Yemen or in Gaza, the West Bank, or Lebanon, or Syria before, and Iraq. Iran helped create this axis and funded and supported it in order to put pressure on the Israeli regime to end ethno-supremacism. That's the objective, to make it too costly, and also to create global awareness, so that this regime would ultimately face the same fate as did the South African regime, the apartheid regime. But Iran is confronting not just the West, not just the collective West, which includes the Five Eyes and the entire EU and Canada and the United States, but it also includes those Arab regimes that you alluded to. It includes Turkey, because all of them were doing business with the Israeli regime during this period. Turkey and Azerbaijan continue to provide Netanyahu with oil, inexpensive oil, cheap oil from Baku, but also from Syria, from the oil wells that the Americans were occupying and continue to occupy in northeastern Syria. They send that oil to Israel alongside Baku oil. So Turkey stood with Israel. Egypt stood with Israel. Jordan, the United Arab Emirates, they all stood with Israel. And those that didn't stand with Israel, they didn't do anything against it. None of the Arab countries took any, a stance against the regime, of course, except for Yemen, which Ansarullah there has huge influence over the government. So it's difficult for Iran to manage the axis of resistance against such a huge coalition of allies of apartheid and ethnic cleansing and genocide, and those who facilitate, at least, the regional countries, apartheid and genocide and ethnic cleansing. So this is a heavy burden, and Iran is heavily sanctioned. So it is understandable for the government to feel the need to balance. On the one hand, you have to meet the needs of ordinary people. You cannot let them starve. You cannot let them be harmed. You cannot let them die of disease. You cannot let them go to hospitals and not have the medicine or the physicians or the supplies that are necessary to save lives. So Iran has to do a balancing act, just like the war between Russia and Ukraine. We saw that the Russians invested a lot in the war, but I've been to Russia numerous times since the war began, and the economy was functioning, and there was a budget for the cities and hospitals because they have to manage Russia too. So it's not easy for Iran. True Promise 1 and 2 was carried out. True Promise 3 has not been carried out so far, but we've heard from the commander of Iran's missile force that Iran will carry out True Promise 3. He didn't say maybe, hopefully, if A or B happens. No, he said True Promise 3 will be carried out. And he said we will have an opportunity. We want to use it to the maximum effect. I'm paraphrasing. He literally said this hours ago, a day ago. So that's one thing that we have to take into consideration. The second is that, and this here I'm speculating, but True Promise 3 was delayed for a couple of reasons. One was because of the fall of Syria, because since the new Al-Qaeda regime has allowed the Israelis to occupy much of Syria and also destroy all of its military infrastructure, and it quietly accepted all of this. This has led to the absence of air defenses in Syria. So the Israeli regime has more scope for maneuver if it wants to carry out an attack on Iran. Of course, the Israelis can't attack Iran on their own. They have to do it with the support of the Americans, and that's exactly what happened on the previous occasion. The Americans were deeply involved in the strike. So Iran has to reorganize its defense capabilities to take into account the new situation on the ground. It had to do that. The second was that there was a second reason, and that was that after Trump became president, after he was elected, there were secret negotiations going on almost immediately afterwards about a ceasefire in Gaza. Trump wanted a ceasefire. And the Iranians did not want to carry out a strike while the ceasefire negotiations were taking place. Because if something, Netanyahu being the sinister monster that he is, of course, all of his companions are sinister monsters, but they would possibly or probably use this as an excuse not to commit themselves to a ceasefire because the regime is completely untrustworthy. Just today, they murdered a young man in southern Lebanon, violating the ceasefire. No one cares. The Western media doesn't care. Western governments don't care. They murder Palestinians in Gaza. They violate the ceasefire in Gaza regularly. Murdering people, killing people is fine to them. Western media doesn't say anything about it. They're not going to complain about it. They'll allow the regime to do whatever it wants. So the Iranians knew that if they gave the regime an excuse, the ceasefire wouldn't happen, or probably wouldn't happen. So the Iranians delayed True Promise 3 until there was a ceasefire. And then when there was a ceasefire, I think the circumstances were such that it wasn't really appropriate for Iran to carry out True Promise 3. But the Iranians will do it. They said they'll do it. I remember the same was said about True Promise 2. True Promise 2 was carried out, after a relatively long delay. And I was actually on a TV program, I think on Piers Morgan, and he said Iran is not going to do it. It's failed. And I said Iran will do it. Iran will carry out the attack. And it by chance, I had no idea. It happened literally hours later. Some people thought I knew. I had no idea. I was just saying, based on my understanding of Iran, that Iran, when it says it will do something, it will do it. And that's why I've been saying True Promise 3 will be carried out, but at an appropriate time.
My assessment was that Iran, with the new security agreement with Russia, that they were playing for time. That we're going to get S-400s, we're going to get air defense, and we want our ducks in a row before we take any action that is kinetic, that may have consequences that they can't necessarily extricate themselves from, if indeed it goes through. Is that your assessment, that a lot of this, on some level, is a reorganization, considering what has taken place in the Middle East, with, as you pointed out, Syria collapsing, Hezbollah being hit very hard, and taking the brunt of Israeli aggression in that region? Yes, the Palestinians, but in a sense of this kind of beyond the Palestinian borders, Lebanon, Hezbollah took that hit more than anyone else. Do you see it that way, as a waiting game, that Iran is effectively reorganizing its defense, let's say, positioning, considering the fall of Syria? And considering their new relationships, that being with Russia?
Iran's agreement with Russia is important, without a doubt. It is a very important agreement that was signed in Moscow in the presence, by the two presidents. But the military relationship between Iran and Russia has already evolved before this. From what we're hearing in the West, Iranian missiles and drones and technology are being used by the Russians in the war. That's what they're saying. And of course, Russian technology is also used by the Iranians. So I don't think that air defenses in particular are perhaps a key issue in this agreement. I think that the cooperation already existed. And also, Iran is producing its own air defense systems. And Iran right now, when it comes to military technology, is, one of the best in the world. Over the last 30 some years, it has really moved forward fast. And I think that Ukraine, allegedly, when they say that the Iranians, these drones are Iranians, allegedly, they can attest to that. If assuming that what they say is true about Iranian drones, then that shows how developed Iranian technology is. I think the Iranian-Russian agreement goes beyond the military. Actually, I think the economic cooperation is very important there. The North-South corridor that will link Iran to East Europe and Russia, and will link Russia to the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean. That is a key, but also Iran and Russia are. Russia has the largest natural gas reserves in the world. Iran is second. Russia and Iran have huge oil reserves. The Russian oil industry is highly advanced, and they can invest in Iran. And Iran can be a hub for Russian energy, Russian grains, Russian wheat. So the cooperation between the two countries, which sadly has been neglected for many decades, thanks to the United States and the Europeans and the sanctions, it has been moved into an entirely different situation. And the two countries have recognized how the huge potential that they've ignored for so long, that they didn't prioritize. So while the military will be important, but I think the economic aspect will be key. And I think economics at the end of the day influence everything else, because if you're more empowered economically, then you're more empowered in other areas as well. So I think that that is there's probably not a direct relationship, but I don't know for certain, because I don't know what decisions are made behind closed doors. These are my general ideas. When I said that, when I spoke of the ceasefire negotiations, the collapse of Syria, that is my I can claim somewhat informed
Yeah, speculation.
speculation that these are issues, but I'm sure there are other issues as well. It could be that Iran was looking for new air defense systems, or Iran was producing new air defense systems. It has to prepare itself as well. I think that is definitely the case. But I think a host of different issues combined. But what I can say is that Iran is much more prepared today than it's ever been before, and that's why I don't think the United States will attack Iran. And if Israel attacks Iran, they will be on the losing end, and they will suffer the consequences. So I personally don't think that there is going to be war in our region between Iran and the United States. I could be wrong, because Trump is Trump, but at the moment I find it highly unlikely.
From your mouth to God's ears. I hope you're right. I don't get the sense that Trump wants a war, but you're right. Trump is Trump. And he has surrounded himself with rabid Zionists. Professor, thank you for this. I don't want to keep you too long. I'm trying to keep it at 30. Professor Mohammad Marandi, he is Professor of English Literature, Orientalism at the University of Tehran. Professor, thank you for this. You be safe.
Thank you, Jamarl. Great speaking to you.
Absolutely. All right. I am going to close this. Let's see. I'm going to end the recording. And we